the global climate crisis has reached to the point of serious concern. Increasingly frequent natural disasters, record-breaking temperatures, and decreasing natural resources highlight the urgent need for critical action. However, traditional democratic systems, characterized by debate, deliberation, and competing interests, are often perceived as too slow or ineffective in addressing environmental challenges. In contrast, authoritarian systems, where decisions can be implemented swiftly and with little opposition, appear to some as an attractive model for confronting the scale and urgency of ecological threats. This concept, termed climate authoritarianism, raises profound ethical and practical questions about governance in the Anthropocene. Here in this episode, we investigate whether the escalating ecological crises of the 21st century could justify the adoption of authoritarian governance models. By analyzing theoretical arguments, empirical evidence, and the potential consequences of such shifts, we seek to evaluate whether climate authoritarianism is a viable solution or a dangerous compromise that undermines fundamental democratic principles. Before we proceed, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel Sociopedia. Let's first understand the concept, climate authoritarianism. It refers to the belief that authoritarian governance systems, with their centralized power structures and reduced procedural barriers, may be better suited to address climate change than liberal democracies. The concept is based in the premise that environmental problems require rapid, large-scale interventions, such as transitioning to renewable energy, enforcing conservation measures, and regulating resource consumption. The key features of climate authoritarianism include: Number 1, centralized decision-making. Power is concentrated in a single authority or governing body, bypassing the checks and balances of democratic systems. Number 2, suppression of opposition. Dissent and debate are minimized to ensure rapid policy implementation. Number 3, technocratic governance. Decisions are driven by scientific expertise and efficiency rather than political compromise. While climate authoritarianism does not necessarily imply a complete dictatorship, it involves elements of authoritarian governance, such as curtailing freedoms and prioritizing state goals over individual rights. Historically, authoritarian regimes have implemented large-scale environmental policies with relative speed. For example, Soviet Union's resource management, while often flawed, allowed for ambitious projects such as large-scale irrigation and afforestation schemes, though many had disastrous ecological and social consequences. Some initiatives undertaken by Soviet Union to address environmental concerns were establishment of environmental agencies. In 1988, the Soviet government formed the State Committee for the Protection of Nature, or Goskompriroda, tasked with overseeing environmental protection efforts. In 1991, Russia enacted its first comprehensive environmental law on environmental protection, which outlined citizens' environmental rights and defined governmental responsibilities. However, the most vivid and recent example of climate authoritarianism comes from China, where government has enforced strict environmental measures, such as rapid deployment of renewable energy projects, reforestation programs, and bans on certain polluting industries. China has over 30 laws, 100 administrative regulations, and 1,000 local regulations concerning ecological and environmental protection, with country's total investment in environmental pollution control reached $128.64 billion in 2022, a substantial increase from the early 1980s. These policies are executed with minimal public consultation, but achieve significant environmental outcomes in a short time. Some of the key achievements of China in environmental protection across various domains are: renewable energy expansion. China achieved its target of 1,200 gigawatts of solar and wind capacity 6 years ahead of schedule. In 2022, China sold 6.8 million electric vehicles, accounting for over a third of global sales. The government aims for electric vehicles to constitute 40% of total vehicles by 2030. Equally, over the past 70 years, China's forest coverage rate increased from 8.6% to over 24%. The 3 North Shelter Belt Forest Program of China has by 2020 afforested 32 million hectares of land, increasing the forest coverage rate in the regions from around 5% in 1978 to about 14%. Overall, China has contributed about a quarter of the world's total new green area since the beginning of this century. Talking about biodiversity conservation, China in 2021 established its first national parks, covering 230,000 square kilometers and housing nearly 30% of the country's key terrestrial wildlife species. The population of Hainan gibbons in China increased from 13 in 2003 to 37 in 2022. Tibetan antelope numbers rose from less than 20,000 in the 1990s to over 70,000. Likewise, in 2023, approximately 60% of Chinese cities met air quality standards, reflecting significant improvements. The proportion of surface water bodies with excellent water quality reached 89.4% in 2023, surpassing the target set in the 14th five-year plan by 4.4 percentage points. These examples illustrate the potential effectiveness of authoritarian approaches. Scholars have debated that climate change requires immediate action, which democratic systems struggle to achieve due to bureaucratic delays and electoral politics. Secondly, authoritarian systems can enforce collective sacrifices, such as reduced consumption or mandatory carbon reductions, without facing public resistance. They can prioritize science-driven policies without interference from lobbying or populist pressures.
Nevertheless, climate authoritarianism often involves restrictions on individual freedoms, including freedom of speech, assembly, and political participation. In the context of climate authoritarianism, these restrictions could manifest as criminalizing climate activism or dissent against state-imposed policies, restricting media coverage of environmental injustices or policy failures, and suppressing marginalized communities disproportionately affected by climate measures, such as forced relocation or resource restrictions. For example, China's reforestation programs, while successful in increasing forest cover, have faced criticism for displacing rural communities and limiting their access to traditional livelihoods. Therefore, authoritarian policies often prioritize efficiency over equity, worsening existing social and economic inequalities. Vulnerable populations, such as indigenous communities and low-income groups, may bear the brunt of environmental measures without receiving corresponding benefits. For instance, large-scale renewable energy projects may lead to land grabs, displacing communities without adequate compensation. Likewise, carbon taxes or consumption restrictions, if poorly designed, can disproportionately affect low-income households. Moreover, the absence of democratic oversight in authoritarian systems increases the risk of corruption, inefficiency, and abuse of power. Without mechanisms for public participation and accountability, there is little guarantee that environmental policies will be implemented fairly or effectively. Now, what could be the democratic alternatives to climate authoritarianism? Rather than abandoning democratic principles, governments can reform democratic systems to address the climate crisis more effectively. Key strategies include institutional reform or establishing independent climate bodies, such as carbon pricing commissions or environmental courts, to ensure long-term science-based policymaking. Secondly, encouraging public engagement through deliberative democracy, such as citizen assemblies on climate change, to build consensus and legitimacy. Thirdly, implementing adaptive governance models that balance long-term planning with flexibility to respond to emerging challenges. Climate change is a global problem that requires international collaboration. Democratic nations can lead by example, fostering multilateral agreements and sharing best practices. Initiatives such as the Paris Agreement demonstrate the potential of cooperative approaches, though stronger enforcement mechanisms are needed. Technological advancements such as renewable energy, carbon capture, and climate modeling offer solutions to the climate crisis without compromising democratic values. Democracies can incentivize innovation through public-private partnerships and investment in research and development. European Union presents one of the best recent examples to demonstrate how democratic systems can address climate change effectively through multilateral cooperation and participatory governance. The European Green Deal aims to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 while ensuring a just transition for affected communities. It also acts on the emissions trading system, a market-based approach to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. European Union has citizen engagement programs, such as the Climate Pact, which encourage public participation in climate action. Some of the significant achievements of the European Green Deal across various sectors include renewable energy adoption. In 2024, the European Union achieved a record milestone, with 47% of its electricity generated from solar and other renewable sources. Nearly 75% of the European Union's electricity production is now free from greenhouse gas emissions. The European Union has surpassed its 2020 carbon dioxide emissions reduction targets, achieving a projected 24.5% decrease since 1990. In terms of water quality enhancements, total European Union water abstraction decreased by 19% between 2000 and 2022. This indicates improved water management and efficiency. Talking about biodiversity and habitat protection, Europe is home to the largest coordinated network of protected areas in the world, known as Natura 2000. Natura 2000 covers significant land and marine regions to safeguard biodiversity. Altogether, the European Union's approach highlights the potential of democratic systems to balance environmental, social, and economic objectives. Therefore, adopting climate authoritarianism raises profound ethical questions. Can the suppression of individual rights be justified in the name of ecological survival? Is it acceptable to prioritize efficiency over equity? These dilemmas underscore the need for a values-based approach to climate governance. Democratic systems, despite their imperfections, provide mechanisms for balancing competing interests and ensuring that policies reflect societal values. Ultimately, the question is not whether we can afford to remain democratic in the face of ecological collapse, but whether we can afford to abandon democracy in our quest for survival. Thanks for watching. Do subscribe to our channel, Sociopedia.